Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this event in memory of our colleague, Andrew Glyn. A warm welcome to everyone here in the auditorium, and also to those joining us on the live stream all around the world. It's great to have you with us, and great to have you with us here in person, and what a delight it is to be in person again, once again, in Corpus. It is always a pleasure to see Professor Wendy Carlin here in Corpus, and also old member Martin Wolfe, and also our colleague for economics, Margaret Stevens, as well. And I would like to give a very warm thank you to all of our panel for joining us. Also, we have joining us remotely Professor John Campbell and Ed Miliband, MP, as well. Very warm welcome to you too. Unfortunately, my colleague James Duffy, the Andrew Glyn Fellow in Economics, is unable to join us this evening, unfortunately, because of COVID. We're all familiar with this. We send our best wishes to James for a swift recovery. He's very, very disappointed not to be able to be with us here today, but we all understand that in these circumstances, there's not a lot that can be done about that. So there's a slight change to the programme in that when we get to the segment where James was going to be talking, I will give a brief readout of a section of his website. So just to remind everybody here what the kind of work is that James is doing. It is wonderful to be able to announce, as we did recently, that the fundraising target of £1 million for the Andrew Glyn Fellowship in Economics has been passed. And it is wonderful to have so many kind friends and contributors in the room here with us, and also remotely. Without your generosity, your affection for Andrew, and your determination to make the endowment of this fellowship possible, we couldn't have done it. And I hope Andrew would be proud and delighted and flattered, and he would probably disclaim any personal influence over all of those former students and friends who have donated. But we know that even though Andrew will probably say, no, it wasn't anything to do with me, it was to do with Andrew, who, as those of us who had the privilege of working with him, being taught by him, or knowing him, will remember, Andrew was an expansive conversationalist, a dedicated student, a wonderful Corpus colleague who engaged in every aspect of Corpus's life. And as I know from sitting next to Andrew at lunches when I was a fellow here very early days, back in the mid-90s, he always had a wonderfully engaging conversational manner that ranged over many, many different subjects. And every year his question to me was, so what do you think, because I'm an English fellow, what do you think of the Booker Prize shortlist? Terrifyingly, it wasn't just an empty question. Andrew had read or knew about the Booker Prize shortlist. So the first couple of times this happened, I sort of, being a new fellow, was overworked with tutorial preparation, hadn't got round to the Booker shortlist, so I sort of laughed nervously and moved the conversation on. After a couple of years, I decided I really had to do my homework. So it is thanks to Andrew that I took up reading the Booker shortlist before Andrew could ask me. And every time it's announced, I think of Andrew. And I'm sure many of us here have our own memories of those little interactions with Andrew. that enriched our lives at the time, and a little bit my book, like my book, a shortlist reading activity, have had lasting impact, even, as I say, when he would disclaim any intent or to have had an impact. So many of us who are still at Corpus knew Andrew, and we do think of him a lot. So it is wonderful to meet with friends, family, and colleagues in order to celebrate the endowment of the fellowship and to remember Andrew together. So thank you very much for coming, and also thank you to our panel for your time as well. So as we move into the section that is notionally headed Professor James Duffy, I will introduce James in absentia rather than him doing it himself. So James read economics at the University of Sydney and received his PhD from Yale. He came to Corpus in 2016, having spent 2 years in Oxford as a postdoctoral research fellow at Nuffield. It's a great pleasure to have James with us as our economics fellow. He provides prelims tutorials for our students in microeconomics and quantitative economics. His research, though, is in econometrics. This is where you can tell I'm really quoting. I quote, "The subfield of economics concerned with statistical methods used to impose empirical discipline on economic models." James's website goes on to describe his work as follows. His work is particularly concerned with the development of better inferential procedures for macroeconomic and financial models that are estimated on time series data that exhibit either on-linearities or a high degree of persistence. His current focus is on developing empirical models that properly account for the zero lower bound constraint on interest rates, a matter of concern to all of us at the moment, which has important consequences for models that are used to gauge the likely impact of monetary and fiscal policy, particularly during a recession. So it would have been very interesting to hear what James would have said about all of that, but I'm sure we will touch on many comparable subjects during the course of the discussion. So if I may, having introduced James and his work, move to the panel segment and hand over to Wendy in the chair. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Helen. And thank you, everyone, for coming. And it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here in this incredibly beautiful room. This replaced a very beautiful garden that Andrew loved, but he loved the room as well. So. And he would have been so pleased to be here in Corpus on such a beautiful summer's afternoon, engaging in thinking about the challenges that we face. So I was going to start with something from the postscript to Capitalism Unleashed that Andrew, he wrote this quoting Chris Giles from the FT in January 2007. "Rarely has the world had it so good. Such a sustained run of good news has not been seen since the early 1970s. So this was the thinking, January 2007. So here we are now, 2022, a 15-year-long sustained run of bad news continues. That's the 15 years since, basically since Andrew died. On the heels of a global pandemic, a war in Europe, broad-based supply shocks, including an oil shock, and all against the background of the rise in inequality that Andrew documented. And then if we just kind of switch back to 1971 in British Capitalism, Workers and the Profit Squeeze, Andrew's famous first book, he said, "For British capitalism, it looks as if this time the wolf, not this wolf, but the wolf is really at the door. From 1964 to 1969, 69 was the year Andrew joined Corpus and when Martin was doing his finals, there was a huge increase in the share of the national income taken by the working class. While economic measures and structural changes could bring some relief to capital, they are unlikely to offer more than a partial way out. Capital's counterattack demands that the struggle assumes a more political character. On the contrary, as we know, the outcome was a radical weakening of the labour movement, macro stabilisation, the years of the Great Moderation, and the global domination of free market ideas, so the era of the triumph of neoliberalism. So that was Capitalism Unleashed. And Andrew spent his final summer in 2007 avidly tracking the news about falling house prices in the US and a rising fear that a financial crisis might be coming to the high-income countries. At the time, we were at the house we often rented in France, near Uzès, and there were avid discussions about what might happen next, I mean, literally day by day. He was a great fan of Gillian Tett, and he realized that he had failed to spot what she had actually spotted, which was the potential of a leveraged finance crisis building in housing and in banking, and that it could be that rather than hedge funds, which is what he thought would bring down or could bring down the financial system. So he'd written about the vulnerability of capitalism to a financial crisis, but he hadn't figured out the form it would take. I spent much of the next 5 or 6 years, along with many others, trying to figure out what had happened and why. For me, it was really back to the drawing board, learning about balance sheets and figuring out how to bring the financial system into a model of the macroeconomy. Andrew would have been brilliant at that. He, alongside his love for Excel spreadsheets, he really knew about balance sheets and about banking. He did understand that, and some of you may have been privy to him telling you that when he was a boy, he was probably telling you about how banks create money, but when he was a boy, he went into the vaults of the bank and tipped bags of cash into the coin sorting machines. So he knew about banks. It was his deep understanding of the economics of the classical economists, passed on in his lectures on Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, that gave him his distinctive lens, I think, for understanding how the world works. And he said in 2007, Labour's share of national income has widely been regarded by economists as one of the great constants of economic development, was one of Nicholas Kaldor's stylized facts. He said, this is rather misleading, for Labour's share has always functioned as an indicator of the fluctuating position of labour in the distributional struggle with employers in the century from the publication of Marx's Capital until the 1970s. Labour's share in the UK showed a distinct upward trend. Since then, a dramatic reversal in Labour's fortunes represents an increase in more than 1/3 of the share of incomes going to capital. So this was really the background, I think, for his work over a lifetime. But there was a puzzle. There was a real puzzle that he pointed to in Capitalism Unleashed. Given the reversal in the fortunes of capital, in the fortunes of the owners of capital from the 1970s onwards, why was it that they had lost their mojo? Why was investment so weak? This, in his view, was the major economic failure of the neoliberal project. And as we know, this weakness was one of the underlying causes of the financial crisis and one of the causes of the decades-long decline in productivity growth in the rich countries. It's still a mystery. It's still a research question that we should all be trying to make progress with. So we're not going to answer the question this afternoon, but we'll get a sense of how what economists are now studying, what commentators are puzzling over, and what economic students are now learning has swung further in the direction of Andrew's scholarship, of his public engagement and his teaching than he could ever have imagined. So that's where we're going to kick off the discussion. And John, hello, John. So John has been based in the economics department at Harvard since 1994, I think, a long time. And it's a great vantage point from which to reflect on what would have most surprised Andrew about the preoccupations of macroeconomists, finance economists over the past 15 years. And the question I asked him, and I haven't required him to answer it, is whether Glyn's facts have replaced Kaldor's facts. So John, your exam question.
Okay, thank you very much, Wendy. I think I'll dodge and duck in classic Oxford style when asked a direct question. But I do want to start by saying that I was a student of Andrew's in the late 1970s at Corpus, and he first showed me what serious economics is. And when I think of Andrew, I think of a well-known quote from Albert Einstein, who said, if I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I would use the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. For once I know the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. Now, Andrew, I think, was a little like that. He was asking the right questions, and questions that not everybody was asking then. More people are asking them now. Questions about the allocation of output between labor and capital, which Wendy mentioned, what it is that determines the real interest rate, the forces driving inequality between people, the strength of competition, or conversely, the degree of market power among firms, the stability of the financial sector, and certainly he was ahead of his time in being very concerned about that, while also asking, what are the political influences on all of the above? Now, since roughly the turn of the millennium, there have been striking trends going on in the world in all these areas. The profit share in the US, the UK, and many other countries has continued to rise on average. It certainly no longer looks constant, as Kaldor alleged, and as I was taught in American graduate school in the 1980s. The real interest rate has declined in a very strong and persistent fashion, which has really surprised everybody. There's been continued increases in inequality of income and wealth. There's a lot of concern, particularly in the US, about weakening competition and increasing markups. And of course, more specifically in technology, the rise of the platform economy. And then politically, the era of the so-called Washington consensus of the 1990s is definitively over. And there's a very wide range of economic structures that are now under consideration. You just need to look at, for example, in France, the range that goes from Jean-Luc Mélenchon to Marine Le Pen to see that. Now, these changes in the world, these ongoing trends, have been accompanied by changes in academic economics. And much of this is the response of the academic economics profession to the world, but there's also some autonomous developments. And let me mention 4 of them specifically. The first is a revival of interest in inequality, and more generally heterogeneity, which is one of those long Greek-derived words that economists love, but it just means the differences between the situations of different economic actors. So very well-known people like the late Sir Anthony Atkinson, Thomas Piketty, obviously have written about inequality and have put it back at the center of our concerns. But in macroeconomics, there's also a tremendous focus now on heterogeneity in the propensity to consume. And that a lot of that builds on the work of Sir Angus Deaton. But the latest generation of macro models in academia are sometimes called Hank models. Hank is heterogeneous agent new Keynesian. And they're really putting the differences between people at the focus and paying a lot of attention to the fact that if in a recession you can get money to people who are living hand to mouth and will spend it, that has a more powerful effect than if the money goes to the rich who will save it. Now, an irony in all this work is that if we turn back to Thomas Piketty for a moment, his view is that wealth inequality inevitably worsens unless there's political action to prevent it, because the rate of return on invested wealth is so high. Yet, as I mentioned, the safe return at least has fallen and is now very low, and that's driven other academic developments. So my second theme is that economists are really trying to adapt economic theory to a low return world. And when returns are very low relative to growth, government debt is less problematic. The burden of the debt is less serious. Savers may react to low safe returns by reaching for yield and taking risk. That's something I've worked on. Asset prices get bid up with implications for inequality. And when inflation is also low, the zero lower bound may constrain monetary policy. And that, of course, is one of the things that the Andrew Glyn Fellow, James Duffy, works on. This has all led to increased interest in expansionary fiscal policy. At the extreme, the so-called modern monetary theory, or MMT, holds that if you can use expansionary fiscal policy without fear of rising interest rates and limited, constrained only by inflation, which you can see coming well in advance. Now, I'm skeptical of that view, and in the US, the developments post-COVID have shown us that inflation can pop up and really take you by surprise. But nonetheless, I think there is clearly much more interest in fiscal policy and its powers relative to monetary policy than was the case a few years ago. Two other themes in academic economics. A third theme is the acknowledgement of market power, a decisive move away from the perfect competition paradigm. So people are thinking hard about the power that firms have in labor markets, their monopsony power, that they're able to some extent control the wages that they pay. And that, for example, may help to explain why a minimum wage increases, at least within a moderate range, don't have big effects on employment. There's a focus on the reluctance of ordinary consumers, households to search, and their limited information and sophistication, which gives the financial industry in particular quite a bit of market power that may justify regulation. And of course, economists are working to figure out the economics of platforms, our technology platforms, which have natural economies of scale and market power. Are these utilities? And if so, should they be regulated accordingly? A fourth theme in academic economics, which has really emerged, I think, since Andrew's death, but I think he'd have been very interested in it, is behavioral economics as a new critique of capitalism. So if you think about, for example, the book by George Akerlof and Bob Schiller, Fishing for Fools, their theme is that if people don't know what is best for them, if they get confused and can be manipulated, then the energy of capitalism that meets market demands so effectively may be misdirected and may cause a lot of harm. And I think economists are now really thinking through what behavioral economics implies for our views about regulation and how capitalism should work. There was a period when it was fairly timid, and people like Thaler and Sunstein in their book Nudge were saying, well, we can give people little nudges, little subtle hints to change their behavior. But I think now there's a recognition that we may need to do more and explore more robust forms of regulation. So all in all, if Andrew were here today, I know he would deplore many of the things that have happened in the world since his death, but I think he would be really delighted by and engaged in many of the intellectual developments in 21st century economics. I think today we're working on many of the questions that Andrew asked so presciently. Unfortunately, we're not Albert Einstein, so it'll take us more than 5 minutes to answer these questions, but that is the task at hand. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, John. You've given us a lot to think about, and really nice connections with a whole series of themes in Andrew's work. And you're absolutely right. I mean, only economists could come up with such a joyless name as heterogeneous agent new Keynesian models. I mean, another way to put it, the way I would prefer to refer to it is we've had the rational expectations revolution in macroeconomics, now we're having the inequality revolution in macroeconomics. So that's perhaps a little bit more spirited than Hank. Let me turn now to Margaret. So Margaret Stevens a friend and colleague of Andrew's, a friend and colleague of mine, who's just stepped down as head of department in the Department of Economics in Oxford. Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you. So Andrew has influenced my career as an economist at various stages. I wasn't taught by him, but Andrew and Wendy were the first economists I ever met. In 1988, when I was thinking of changing career from being a secondary school maths teacher to studying economics, they were the people I talked to find out what it was all about. And a few years later, Andrew gave me my first teaching assignment, tutorial teaching assignment in economics, which was to teach some corpus students to give tutorials in the microeconomic principles paper. That was part of the curriculum then. And he was the person who really helped me to understand the different challenges of teaching economics in comparison with what I'd previously done in mathematics. I worked with him later when I was a tutorial fellow at Lincoln, and he was one of, I think at the time, a minority of economists in the economics department who was doing applied research. He was also director of undergraduate studies for a while, and we worked together on reforms to try to bring more applied economics, to integrate applied economics into the undergraduate curriculum at the time. On the question of how, I mean, John's talked about how research in economics has changed. The question I'm going to try to address is how economics teaching has changed, or how it should be changing. And I want to start by recording a conversation I had in 2011 with one of my students at Lincoln. Her name was Jasmine. She was in her third year. She was an excellent student, very hardworking, very talented. And she told me that she'd started PPE with so many questions about the global economy and so many things she wanted to know. She wanted to change the world. But none of her questions had really been answered in 3 years of studying PPE. So she decided to go on to do graduate work in economics in the hope that there really would be some answers if she went deeper into her study of the subject. So of course I was delighted she wanted to go on to study economics further, but she really made me think about what we were doing wrong. If such a good student, such a committed student, had found the course that she'd taken as an undergraduate here so unsatisfying. And one of the answers, I think, is that so much of what we teach, we taught then and still do to some extent, is focused on answering the questions of earlier generations. So Jasmine would have learned a great deal about economic developments in the 1970s and the 1980s, but very little, almost nothing, that would help her to understand her questions in the 21st century about globalization, about inequality, and the financial crisis. And if we want to motivate students and provide them with the tools that they need to understand the world as it is, then we need to take seriously the big questions facing us in the present. And that's what prepared me for a conversation with Wendy a couple of years later about the ideas she had that eventually became the core project in an attempt to, and perhaps I think we can say a fairly successful attempt to radically change the teaching of economics. Since 2016, when courses were first launched, beginning economics students have been asked, what do you think are the most pressing questions that economists need to be thinking about, need to be addressing in the world today? And the winner, by far, the dominant theme every year has been inequality. And then the environment and climate change has become increasingly prominent in the answers to those questions. Also at various times and places, COVID and Brexit. But the big themes of climate change and inequality are really the questions that students want to understand the answers to now. And it's really not good enough for us to give the old answers to those questions, like, you know, if you you'll be able to study climate change in your third year, but really it's just an example of an externality. And what you need to do is learn how competitive markets work first in order to understand that. In fact, both of these issues are really huge and pervasive and affect almost everything we study and everything we teach. It's just that because we always have sidelined them, they haven't been important in the past, or haven't seemed important in the past, we continue to do that. So the kinds of things that I'm thinking about in terms of the way we teach things, in the way we construct the curriculum, almost every single question of microeconomic and macroeconomic policy has implications for distribution. But what we present students with are micro models that focus on efficiency, and macro models that pretend that the economy can be analysed in terms of a representative agent, not Hank models, or not very much in the curriculum yet. And why do we hardly ever talk about the tools that can be used to assess the distributional implications? We know that people are not indifferent between unemployment and employment, and that minimum wages don't seem to increase unemployment. So we have straightforward models that can explain why that's the case, and yet we continue to teach a model that doesn't explain either of those things. Climate change is clearly not just an externality to be corrected using a Pigouvian tax after your second year micro course. It's really integral to questions about economic development and growth and sustainability, technological progress, global trade, global institutions, and migration. So, of course, it's a lot easier to describe what we're getting wrong than to put it right. But the principle behind the core project and what seems to me more generally to be the right principle for thinking about what we teach is to think about the questions that we need to answer when we're designing courses. The conventional approach to course design is that we start with a body of economic theory that we have to convey, and then we illustrate it with a few applications. But what that approach doesn't recognize is that that body of economic theory was constructed around old questions, the questions at the time that people were asking in economics. And those are not necessarily the right questions that we need to be thinking about now. So the new approach, the different approach, is to start with the questions and then construct the course around the principle of teaching students, of giving students the tools that they need, the models that they can apply to think like an economist and answer those questions for themselves, because that's what they'll need to do in the world going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Great. Yes, I think Andrew would be surprised at what's happened and the fact that in some classrooms, in maybe the majority of universities in the UK now, in that first course, they do begin with the big problems that are facing the world, and there's I think a much lower chance that they will exit being disappointed, which is the starting point that you began with. So let me turn to Martin. Martin doesn't really need any introduction. Andrew always thought of Martin as a wonderfully constructive critic of his books. His main beef with Martin, you know what's coming, Martin, was that only Martin was allowed to have charts in his FT columns, and Andrew had to make do with words. I don't think he ever forgave you for that, Martin, and he held you personally responsible. So, over to you.
He is in, that's interesting, I didn't know that. It remains the case, and I have never been able to discover why. And believe it or not, I do ask. It's nothing to do with me. It is absolutely nothing to do with me. You don't realize that decisions of this kind are taken by much more important people called editors. And the idea of the editor seems to be, I don't fully understand this idea, which seems to me very confused, is that really nobody's very interested in charts. But I suppose if you're the main economics commentator for the newspaper, you have to be allowed to mess up the pages with them. But we're not going to allow it for anybody else. But I'm perfectly happy to continue this war on behalf of you and others. But that's the story anyway. There's one person in the audience who was at the FT at one time. I don't know whether, Jerry, you also felt victimized by the inability to have charts. Let me start. Yes, well, that goes without saying. Not enough, I tend to feel, but we can get to that later. I've never taught economics, and I decided very many years not to be an academic. So the discussion on how to teach economics doesn't concern me. I decided, in fact, when I left Oxford, that the idea of teaching the same courses, but perhaps to the same people who are always the same age and that leave as soon as they've achieved a level of maturity will be completely maddening, and I couldn't cope with it for a minute. So anyway, I didn't do that. I was lucky enough to be taught by Andrew before he got to Corpus, that's how old I am, in 1968, I think, when I'll come to that in a second, how this happened with me. And he was then a doctoral student at Nuffield. And at that stage, we had no economics fellow in Corpus. I was here at Corpus. And so the principal's paper, the principal paper in PP was taught by a man called Francis Seaton, who was an expert on the communist economies at that time. And the organization paper was taught by Andrew. And I have to be very grateful to them, and particularly to Andrew. I think was a considerably better teacher, I may say, because I started PP in 67 after having done classics here, because basically you weren't allowed to come to Corpus if you weren't a classicist, more or less. There was a quarter of the students, and I did mods here, and which I've never regretted, and I said, that's enough of that, I really need to learn some economics, so I switched to PPE, and despite having essentially no mathematics, a situation which more or less remains the case to this day, despite my efforts from time to time to understand it, and having no background in the subject whatsoever, they steered me to a quite reputable degree. So I'm very, very grateful to them. And that allowed me to pretend I'm an economist. I do understand the pretense involved. So Andrew was a wonderful teacher, an incredibly nice man. And one of the things I've come to realize over time is that his form of radicalism, not only completely intellectually honest and engaged, is also incredibly valuable for those like me who don't share his, or didn't share, I'll go to that in a moment, his politics. And I want to give I'm going to quote from Capitalism Unleashed, which is the book of his that made the biggest impact on me, and I'm going to talk about that now and why I think it's such a significant and interesting book. But this is a quotation which indicates his honesty, and it is immediately followed in the text by one which also indicates how prescient he was and how relevant what he said was. So this was written, I think, in 2005. This was the introduction, and he's referring back to the collapse of the Soviet Union and Soviet communism, and he says, "Old certainties which I shared, that economic problems will be readily solved once free market logic was supplanted by a planned economy operating according to production for need, now seem far too abstract to carry much conviction or political credibility." And I think that's about as good a mea culpa as you can offer about things you believe passionately which turn out to have been wrong. And I admire it. Not many people do that. Then I will go on to his next paragraph, which shows his prescience, written, as I said, in 2005. However, we are not at the end of economic history, to adapt a famous catchphrase. On the contrary, new questions have been thrown up by the unleashing of capitalism in the 1980s. Will the ever more complex financial system implode in a major financial crisis and bring prolonged recession? Will the integration of the vast labor supplies of China and India into the world economy shift the balance of power even further in the direction of employers and bring a sustained shift in the distribution of income from labor to capital in the rich countries, or a renewed outbreak of distributional conflict in the industrializing countries? Finally, can the welfare states of Northern Europe survive the combined pressures of globalization and free market ideology and be developed in ways that meet the aspirations of egalitarians? And I think it's pretty obvious these questions have become, since he wrote that, really pretty damned relevant. Now, he has, in asking those questions and the focus of the book, has a very good reason to feel in substantial measure vindicated. I would love to have a discussion with him now, but let me say a little bit now about how those questions, with which I've also been concerned as a commentator, have developed in my own mind in somehow reflection of the very questions he asked over the last roughly 16 or 17 years. At the time he was writing his book, I was writing a book which subsequently appeared called Fixing Global Finance, which was actually puzzled by trying to explain why was investment so weak, what were the consequences of that, and why in particular at a time when, which seemed to me the core macro phenomenon at the time, at a time when investment was so weak in developed countries and the Chinese and other developing countries were investing more than anybody had ever done in history, there was actually a flow of capital from them to us, which is, I think, very closely linked to the phenomena he was concerned with. And I can't say that I fully worked out at the time why these were happening. I think I've got a much clearer idea now. I won't go into that now because there isn't time. But what it did mean is that those surplus savings in emerging economies had to be absorbed, and I won't explain why it had to be, because that was the adjustment mechanism, within developed economies, and particularly in the US economy. And what that meant as a matter of arithmetic, but also policy, and since there wasn't any investment and corporate profits were quite strong, as Andrew pointed out, that there had to be a huge borrowing requirement in either the household sector or the government sector, and basically rotated between the two. And that meant an enormous explosion of debt, particularly pre-crisis in the household sector, and that blew up. And your comment about Gillian Tett's analysis is that, well, I understood the macro, I think, pretty well, and that is in the book. I didn't understand how the crooks, Wall Street was doing it, and she did. So that's really important part of my own evolution, and I subsequently wrote a book called The Shifts and the Shock, which tried to explain my ex-post understanding of how all that fitted together. Now, in my last few minutes, a couple of minutes, I'd like to move on because it's become pretty obvious in the last 6 or 7 years that all those political questions that were implicit in Andrew's work, namely what will the shifts in the distribution of income, the enormous increases in inequality, the changes in the position of organized labor and of the working class more broadly, how is that going to affect politics? Now, I don't want to go into the detail of this, but I have a new book coming out in January next year called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, and it has many echoes of his book. It discusses the role of the financial system, the bailouts of the financial system and the politics of the power of capital, the role of corporates, the slowing productivity, very important, and the links of all that with politics and the purchase of politics. And this these things, which can be regarded as economic in some respects, but are political in others, are obviously political in the first order. And the thing that, as a result, I've become absolutely fascinated with and completely intersect with what the core idea, it seems to me, of Andrew in his life, is that you can't really separate politics and economics at all. They're just two aspects of the same thing, which is what I've discussed at length in my book. And mostly, so I would add to your comments, that I think even more now than I did when I did in the time, that the attempts to discuss economics without discussing how politics work is completely unworkable and shouldn't be permitted. Instead of thinking that economics is a branch of mathematics, you should think that economics is a branch of politics. So obviously everybody should do maths and politics and economics and philosophy, by the way, and that after 10 years they could say something useful about this subject. Now, my final comment I would make, that as a result of these experiences and these ideas and learning from him and others, I have moved back quite significantly, as many people will realize from reading anything I write, to what might be seen as a social democratic view of things. So I remain absolutely fervently a believer that Marxism, as it has been practiced politically, as opposed to an analytical system, is pernicious and dangerous. And Andrew and I will continue probably to disagree on that, perhaps less than he early in his life. But I do believe we are in a situation in which our democratic systems will founder if we don't manage somehow to bring about quite substantial economic reform and also political reform. And they are going to founder, I think, very clearly in the populist authoritarianism of the right or left. And if we can't see that, I don't think we can see anything at all. And he, I'm quite sure, would not be in the least surprised.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, indeed. Okay, so I think that's a very appropriate moment to bring in Ed. Are you there, Ed?
I am here, Wendy.
Excellent. You've
I'm sorry I'm not there, but I'm really glad to join you. And you know, this is such a stellar panel, and listening to John and Margaret and Martin and you, Wendy. I'm a mere humble politician, so I'm not going to speak with the same expertise as the other people who have spoken. I want to talk about Andrew as a person, as an economist, just from my perspective, and then his relevance today. And it will echo a lot of what has already been brilliantly said by others. I mean, look, the first thing to say is Andrew was a lovely person. And it was a privilege. I knew both him and Wendy before I went to Corpus. And that was an immense privilege. And it was an immense privilege to be taught by him, and to be friends with him after college. And, you know, he's much, much missed today. And it was his, I mean, we all have experienced it, anyone who knew him. You know, if you say Marxist economist, it doesn't sort of immediately kind of necessarily send the signal of, you know, fun-loving guy, maybe. But he had incredible warmth, an incredible sense of fun, an incredible kindness. And I think there is something rather interesting about him, which it's sort of going to take me on to Andrew as an economist and as a teacher, that he was deeply ideological, but he wasn't sectarian, and he was passionate about his politics, but he didn't sacrifice rigor. And he was incredibly dismissive of those who used to engage in what he called hand-waving, which was people who would just sort of say things that didn't have any basis in fact or evidence. So that is him as a person. Then him as an economist, I was very struck by what Margaret said about understanding the world, about doing economics to understand the world. And I think I think in a sense, I took it slightly for granted. I now realize, because I was taught by him as an undergraduate, that that's what being an undergraduate economics student was like. But I think I was wrong to take it for granted, certainly in that era. And I know, Wendy, you're doing incredible work to change that. Now, I think it, and I say this with humility, I think there are some things about him and the way he was as a teacher and an economist that helped him be somebody who could teach you about the world. First of all, he took capitalism seriously as a set of created institutions, not institutions that arrived in some perfect form, but created by political and economic forces. And I think that infused his teaching. He did, as others have said, take power incredibly seriously, the balance of power between capital and labor in particular. And that's where I certainly agree with Martin that, the analysis that was part of his Marxism, taught me something very important. And then thirdly, he took, and this is related to the second point, he took distribution seriously. And this point that John made about inequality, it wasn't fashionable to be talking about inequality when he was talking about inequality, but he took it incredibly seriously in a period in the 80s, 90s, and indeed the 2000s, when inequality was not talked about in anything like the same way it is today. And then let me say something about his relevance today. And Martin, you stole my quote, because I was going to read exactly the same quote and describe his just sort of, such foresight for a book written in 2006, I believe. And so, what he was writing there, and Capitalism Unleashed, was deeply anticipatory of what came next. I represent a constituency, Doncaster North, that voted by more than 70% for Brexit. And when people say to me, why did people in your constituency vote for Brexit? Was it about immigration? Was it about the EU? And of course, those things were issues. But the system of capitalism that we had and still have is a large part of the explanation. And lots of the roots of Brexit, and indeed Trump, you can find in Andrew's tables and data in Capitalism Unleashed. And so he's very relevant today. Secondly, we're in an inflation world. I mean, we're in a world that Andrew would have recognized in some senses from his earlier work. And forgive me, this has been covered already, but I think that one of the things that would have fascinated Andrew about this moment is what is the impact of the kind of inflation we're seeing, which we haven't seen for 30 or 40 years, in a world where unions and organized labor are much weaker. In other words, he would have told us that we must think of inflation not simply as a technocratic problem to be addressed by the Bank of England, but as a deeply distributional question. And it seems to me that issue of inflation being a deeply distributional question is quite missing from from much of the debate that is happening today. And then thirdly and finally, what is his relevance today? And I think it relates again to what Martin said about him. He was an analyst, but also an advocate. And I won't cover all the different advocacy he did, but I remember he wrote a pamphlet in the 1980s called 1 Million Jobs a Year about how you could address the terrible unemployment, mass unemployment that there was. I think he would have been inspiring us and pushing us not just to analyze the market economy we have, but, and this is what's interesting about him, but within the confines of what's possible, change it, change the way it worked, make it fairer, change the balance of power at the workplace. So I think he would have been analyzing brilliantly the situation we find ourselves in, but I think he would have been also advocating persistently, eloquently for something better. I'll just end by saying this. You know, I feel incredibly privileged to have known him as a friend and been taught by him. And I think it's absolutely brilliant that Corpus have established this position in his name. And I think it's incredibly fitting. And I think it will, I hope, produce great work in his tradition.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think we've had a set of contributions that kind of very nicely dovetail with each other in giving us a really sort of rich picture of the world and how the questions that we need to understand, how those questions were picked out in a quite a prescient way by Andrew, how his big questions are the ones that have come to animate a lot of research over the last decade and a half in a way that I think was rather unpredictable. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about how useless economists were and how they'd failed to predict the financial crisis, and you know, they were just doing very abstract mathematics, and that they were failing. They were failing us in failing to provide insight. And I think that really has changed. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done, but if you were to look at the abstracts of economics papers published in the so-called top economics journals over recent years, you would find these themes, the themes we've been talking about, ranging from economics to politics. You would find them all there. And some of the best minds in the profession are hard at work doing very empirically driven work, informed by the best kinds of theory and pushing the theory forward, but that interplay between the questions, the data, the facts, and how we can best deploy economic ideas to understand them. I think that's how Andrew taught, that's how he did his research, and that has been, it's done in different ways, but it has become a much more accurate picture of at least a good chunk of the profession, and of the way that younger scholars think about their role. So many of them now really think about the fact that they're solving problems out there in the world. So I think he'd be rather cheered up by that. So I think we should invite some questions from the audience here, questions from our online audience. This is my little connection to the online questions if they emerge. So I think here in the audience we can begin with some questions. Jerry, I'm sure you have a question.
One very brief anecdote, and then a question. My favorite anecdote of Andrew, I agree with what everybody said. What a marvelous man he was, what a wonderful teacher he was, incredibly rigorous teacher. One of the, as Ed said, you don't always think of necessarily Marxist economists and think what a fun person they are, but you also don't think of Marxist economists necessarily, or Marxist teachers as being extraordinary disciplinarians, but he was actually the most rigorous and demanding of, I think, of all the tutors that I had. He was the one person who really had the least tolerance for sloppy work, lateness, or anything else. He was an extraordinarily rigorous man. My favorite anecdote, I was actually an undergraduate in the early 1980s when, in the early years of the Margaret Thatcher government, and I do remember, and as everybody has said, Andrew was not particularly one of the hallmarks of his extraordinary qualities as a teacher was that whatever his own political views, he really didn't let them drive the educational experience. But I do remember, of course, in the early 1980s, it was especially in 1981, when my first year as an undergraduate, the UK economy was in free fall, and I do remember him noting with particular, he'd done a little bit of just sort of some simple research, and remember him noting with particular glee that the stock market, the FTSE index in 81, I can't remember the exact dates now, but the FTSE index in 1981 hit its low point in the cycle, and he'd calculated that in real terms in 1980, at that point in 1981, it was actually lower than it had been in real terms in June 1940. And he used to take great pleasure in opening several of our tutorials by saying, you do realize that global investors currently have less optimism and faith in the British economy than they did on the eve of Hitler's planned invasion of Britain. But my question is, I wonder, I was very interested in what John said about the way in which the economics profession has changed in the last 15 years, and also in what everybody said about the time, you know, the tragic timing of Andrew's death. Not just obviously a great loss to all of us, but at a particular moment when so much of what he had written was about to be vindicated. I wonder what people think right now as we went through that period of 2007, 2009, and the global financial crisis and the recession, and the real sense that capitalism was on the precipice. And we are now here 15 years later, it seems to me, and Martin has written extensively about this, in the throes of yet another economic crisis. But I wonder what's been missing to me from a lot of the discussion about the current economic conditions is the extent to which there are specifically financial risks in the system. And I wonder, I know Andrew would have been interested in this, given what we've seen to equity markets, both equity and bond markets in the last 6 months, the dislocation that we've seen, the extraordinary fall simultaneous fall in both equity and bond markets. I wonder whether, particularly any of the panel thinks that, but there are. Once again, these are highlighting. There isn't much discussion about the risks that serious financial dislocation could pose to the economy. I wonder whether we have sort of moved on from the kind of from the risks posed by the financial system to the global economy to the broader risks that we're all concerned about with inflation and longer term risks. I wonder if any of the panel thinks that once again we are perhaps in the early stage, perhaps facing the serious risk of really serious financial dislocation as this period of high inflation, high interest rates to tackle it, slow growth, probably recession, as that unfolds over the next year or so.
Good question. So, John, do you want to chip in on this one?
Yeah, let me take a crack at it. I certainly think it would be very foolish in a time this volatile to minimize the risk of financial disruptions. There's tremendous stresses on the system, and they're bound to show up somewhere. I do think that the times, though, are very different from the global financial crisis period of the late 2000s in a couple of important ways. One is that household balance sheets look much healthier now. Of course, COVID had very asymmetric impacts. Some people were very badly affected, but many other households sat at home earning income and unable to spend it, and actually accumulating assets, and that has helped to create inflationary pressures now as the spending power chases goods. But it does mean that households are less vulnerable than they were in the late 2000s. Second point is that actually, if one's worried about debt burdens, inflation is surprisingly helpful, so long as it's nominal debt that's not totally floating rate. Which is generally the case in many countries. Inflation relieves debt burdens. And so that may also limit the problems caused by leverage. I do think we're seeing some tremendous instability. I mean, the collapse of cryptocurrencies is one very striking phenomenon right now. I am hopeful that crypto collapse is coming early enough. In other words, that the crypto bubble didn't inflate to the point at which when it bursts, it can bring down the whole real economy. Now, I may be too sanguine about that, but so far it looks as if the collapse of the crypto bubble is teaching a lot of crypto market participants a very valuable lesson without pulling down the whole of the rest of the economy. So indeed, many risks, but I do think it's a very different environment in some of the details than we saw in the late 2000s.
Yeah.
Something on this, Wendy?
Yes.
Because
of course. No,
there are things to add to everything John said is obviously right. One thing that quite a few of my friends are focusing on, which I think will be significant, though not possibly crisis, is the wealth effect of the stock market fall, particularly in the US, where it's big and the wealth in the stock market is very large. I think the stock market was worth 2 times GDP. It's fallen 20%, so that's about 40% of GDP, if I remember correctly. Every day it's slightly different, and if you do fairly standard assumptions about wealth effects on people's spending, it isn't big enough to cause a recession, but it knocks up 1 or 2% off spending, which is quite significant where fiscal policy is tightening a lot and monetary policy is tightening a lot. So that's important, and of course the US has a big effect on the world. No other large economy is so exposed. But I want to add I agree very strongly on inflation, but there's another aspect, 2 other aspects I'd focus on. 3. First, most people are confident, or most of the people I talk to are confident that the banking sector is much stronger. I have no independent view on this, except that I always doubt it. But that's it. The second point, which is more comforting, is that because of COVID and what followed, a very large part of the additional debt in our economies in the last few years has been government debt. And that's what I argued for after the financial crisis, that we, instead of relying on the monetary policy mechanism, which was a credit reflation play, when interest rates were already so low, governments should borrow, and they should borrow long term. They didn't borrow this time long term enough, in my view. And of course, QE got in the way there, and I'm not convinced about QE, but I won't, partly for this reason, but that's a very complicated issue. But anyway, the key point is, of all the debtors in the system, the governments are the least bad. They're the least likely to go. Yeah, I mean, if you're borrowing in your own currency, the worst that happens is you get inflation. And as John said, they've managed that, and that's going to be a big deal, by the way. I mean, if we assume that inflation will continue at these rates for a couple of years or close to it, or accumulate to that, yeah, that's going to get rid of about 20% of it. There are 2 important exceptions. Within the Eurozone, as I pointed out last week, there are countries that aren't borrowing effectively in their own currency. They're borrowing in the currency they share with other people, some of whom are German. And it's not clear how they will handle severe government debt problems in the Eurozone, and they are perfectly likely, and I think, and that's a very big and live debate now. So that's one place where big problems could arise. And the other one, of course, is all the developing countries who borrow in foreign currency, and there are a lot of them, though most of them are relatively small and poor. Ian Golden is, I see, in the audience, and he would recognize that problem. I expect a lot of developing and emerging countries to go belly up in the next year or 2, and we don't really have the systems to handle it for many reasons, one of which is that one of their most important creditors is China, and China and the West don't cooperate on this. So there will be debt problems, but they'll be in completely different places, and I do believe that in the core Western countries, inflation is a much bigger issue, and everything connected with that, and how we stabilize, and the income distribution effects mentioned are very, very significant. That's the big issue, not that there are going to be a huge amount of defaults, and that's famous last words. Yeah. Non-financial corporate's the other bit. The private equity business might be wiped out. It couldn't happen to nicer people.
Well, Martin. Yeah, well, actually, I think that the combination of those two, I'd actually scribbled some notes, but I have nothing to say anymore. So that was a fantastic response, actually. And your point, Jerry, about the financial fragility, in a way, Andrew's misdiagnosis of the preconditions to the 2007-2009 crisis is sort of the answer to your question now as well. So leverage and where leverage sits is crucial, I think. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So now there is a question from out there. By the way, if you're out there online and you want to ask a question, it'd be lovely if you said who you were, so we could pass that on. So there's a question to John. How have you taken lessons from your own experience of being taught by Andrew into your own teaching of undergraduates, if you've been teaching undergraduates in your long career? It's a question to you, John.
Yes, well, I certainly have been teaching undergraduates throughout. And, you know, I think Andrew taught me to try to get questions in early to help undergraduates have questions in their mind that motivate them in the study of economics.
So John, can I just ask you, in your new course, if you're thinking about where you start from, you know, that would give a very practical example.
Yes, so I've just recently started teaching a course which introduces economics through the lens of personal finance. So undergraduates are very interested in personal finance, both for the obvious reasons that they may have immediate things they want to figure out, like how to get a credit card and how to manage student debt and so forth. But also, we have, I'm glad to say, at Harvard, more and more first-generation college students who feel a tremendous responsibility to their own families and to come back from college with some sort of savvy and understanding that they can share with their families and their communities. So there's tremendous motivation there. And what I try to do is exploit that, you know, use the energy that they have and the questions that they're asking to give them some practical knowledge that will help them, certainly, but also then to introduce them to very basic economic concepts like discounting, risk and return, diversification, adverse selection, search, economics of search. Lots of things, lots of economic ideas can be taught through personal finance. And then finally, I try to broaden it out, and I guess there's Andrew's influence there too, to talk about how we might make the financial system work better for ordinary people. What types of changes are needed? You know, is technology, fintech, is that helping or hurting? What is the role of regulation? Are nudges enough, or do we need more robust regulation? And if so, what? And you know, what does a good mortgage system look like? It looks very different in different countries. So what's the best system? So I try to get them then to think broadly about not just their own savvy decision-making, but how the system might be improved. So I'm very enthusiastic about doing this. It's sort of a new way to bring students into economics.
Yeah. Great. Can I just push you a little bit, John, to connect that with the fourth of the points that you made earlier about behavioral economics? And you said, okay, it was all pretty kind of modest, you know, telling people to tick a box about whether they wanted, they had to kind of, they were opted in and unless they were opted out from pensions and so on. So you were suggesting that what behavioral economics was teaching us was that much stronger, it was providing much stronger impetus for public policy than those kind of modest nudges. And I wondered if you had an example.
Yes. All right, so one of the themes that I try to bring out in the course is that there are a lot of financial products that involve a cross subsidy from the poor to the rich, or from the less educated, lower income, less sophisticated people to wealthier, better off, savvier people. And one important example is mortgages and mortgage refinancing. So in the UK, that works through teaser rates. The savvy thing to do is get a mortgage, get the teaser rate, nimbly refinance after a year or two to the next teaser rate, and keep doing that. And if you don't know to do that, you're going to end up paying a much higher rate than you need to. In the US, the equivalent thing is that we have primarily fixed rate mortgages, and you need to refinance when the rate falls. If you don't do that, you're going to end up paying too much. And there's more and more evidence. I've done some of this research myself. There's more and more evidence that the people who end up paying higher rates are less educated, less sophisticated. In the US, they're often racial minorities. And the effect of the system is to penalize poorer people and benefit richer people. And ironically, richer people actually get lower mortgage rates than they would in equilibrium if nobody was making this mistake, because the revenue that comes to the mortgage lenders from people who don't refinance, some of that at least gets passed back in the form of lower mortgage rates for everybody else. So I try to make that very clear to people. What it then means is that unless you think you can educate everybody to eliminate this mistake, which is a bit of a tall order, you really should think about trying to design a system that cuts out this cross-subsidy from disadvantaged people to people with more advantages. And so I try to develop that theme. I think it's one that Andrew would have appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Ian, you have a question.
Thanks very much. Ed highlighted what a fun person Andrew was, and that's certainly how I remember. One of the things I miss most about him is he used to, every year on my birthday, give me a cassette of his favorite jazz music to educate me. And since he passed away, I'm no longer being educated on who's great, and he had incredible impeccable taste. He also had a great love for sport. The real thing he wanted to do when he stayed with us in Washington was to go to basketball, which I'd never been to before, with Johnny. But totally fun. Two areas that I think he would have also proved right on, which I didn't appreciate at the time. The one is, I was doing my doctorate and thinking about globalization here, and he was very insistent that this internationalization of the division of labor would be a major threat to the standards of living of workers in the advanced economies. And I was far less convinced at the time, and I think history has really proved him right, and the politics of that. And the other thing which we used to always debate, that I think he was ahead of his time, and Ed, I'd be very interested in your comment on this in terms of the Labour Party, is he was deeply skeptical, of course, of the mainstream of the Labour Party, as he was of the ANC, which I was very active in, and supported a breakaway from the ANC, because he said it would be captured. And indeed, I thought that was not going to happen, and has happened. But I don't know whether you feel, Ed, that with the wisdom of hindsight, that where his position on the Labour Party was on the right side of history.
I'm so glad you asked that question, Ian. Look, I tell you what I think is interesting about Andrew, and in a way he shares this characteristic with my late father, which is that he was both skeptical that the Labour Party could be the vehicle for his ambitions for society, but respectful of those who worked within it to push the envelope as far as they could to try and make a difference in the here and now. And he would have probably accepted that there was no alternative way in the here and now if you were in mainstream politics of doing that. So I think he would have, if he was alive today, he would no doubt have been rowing with me and lots of other people, not rowing, but arguing politely with me and other people about, why wasn't Labour more radical and so on. He would have very much enjoyed the Corbyn-McDonnell era, I'm sure, and would have probably done a lot of work with John McDonnell. I was thinking before this this talk. But I think what was magical about him was that he could be frustrated by the constraints of the Labour Party. But as I say, he was not just respectful, but he would sort of work to make it better. And in a sense, I think he kind of had a sense of responsibility that, you know, you could both sort of think about the long-term future, but he kind of understood the need to try and make a difference in the here and now. Yeah. Wendy would have a better view on this than me, whether that's correct.
No, I think you've captured it. I think you've captured it very well. Yes.
Tim Clark. I was a pupil of Andrew's in the mid-70s, which obviously was a time at which all of the issues that have been discussed this afternoon were very prominent. And Andrew's tutorials were wonderfully stimulating as a result. An anecdote of my last conversation with Andrew, which must have been late 2006, early 2007, after the publication of Capitalism Unleashed. And we discussed late, and really rather late, the paradox, which I think Martin referred to, of the high returns to capital, but the paradox of low investment. And we got onto the subject of, from a practitioner's point of view, of the interrelationships between corporate executives, CEOs and chairs, and the asset managers of the owners of capital, and the extreme short-termism, which, Martin, you've written about a great deal. And I gave him many anecdotes of what it was like, that relationship, and he was fascinated by it. And he said, I must dig into this more. Can I get back in touch with you? So, of course, and a few weeks later, certainly he died. And I wondered, to your point about the application of these behavioral issues, these institutional mechanisms, which Warren and I, it dominates our lives as ex-CEOs, corporate chairman, of those relationships with capital and the barriers to investment. Whether academic economists are studying that. Andrew certainly had a high appetite to get into it.
John, do you want to come in on that in terms of what work is actually being done on this this kind of paradox of high profitability and weak investment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's related to a big debate about whether we're properly capturing investment anymore with both our corporate accounting system and our national accounting system. You know, in an era where a lot of investment is in various intangible forms of capital, whether that's literally software or R&D or just the soft knowledge about how to organize very complex production processes. It's just not really clear whether we're capturing investment properly. And this gets to the question of asset values. You know, are corporations extremely valuable, you know, even after the recent decline in the stock market? They're very highly valued relative to recent earnings. Is that because there's actually a lot of intangible capital in those corporations that we haven't measured? Or is it instead that discount rates are very low, or perhaps investors are irrationally exuberant and it'll all come crashing down? The same sorts of issues actually arise when you think about what's paid to capital and what's paid to labor, because a lot of very highly paid individuals in modern capitalist economies are getting payments that where it's a little unclear how much is a payment to their human capital, to their skill, and how much is actual profit because they own something. So, you know, if you're a partner in an asset management company, as for example I am on the side from my academic job, and the company pays me, am I being paid as a part owner, as a partner, or am I being paid for the work that I did and the skill that I bring? It's really quite hard to disentangle. So, you know, intangible capital and perhaps a diminished need for traditional physical capital that we can measure. Particularly think of an era of slowing population growth. You know, that certainly reduces the need for the traditional infrastructure. China, of course, has been the great exception that's invested enormously in physical infrastructure, housing, transport, but that they may have reached the limit of their model. They've already paved China. There may not be much more to do on that. So I don't know if that answers the question, but those are a few thoughts to get us started anyway.
Yeah, plenty to do. I've got a question on here, but I'm getting a...
to myself, because the question is from me. So I'm Beginner Cox. Hello. I am working here as a fundraiser, and I worked alongside Liz Lyle as a fundraiser to endow the post in the name of Andrew. I humbly say I've never met Andrew before, but I feel like I've met him through the stories and amazing feedback that we received as an office from his alumni and also donors to the post. Question from me, as a fundraiser, we always think of whenever we're fundraising for such incredible, important posts as endowment for posts, we're not only thinking about the current post holder and the current students or the past students and Andrew, but we're also thinking about the next post holder, the next students that will carry Andrew on their shoulders because of the name of the fellowship. And this is more of a question maybe to you, Wendy, and maybe Ed, but I really would also welcome Martin, Margaret, and John to share. What do you think would be Andrew's feedback to the next generations of Andrew Glyn Fellowship fellows at Corpus?
I think it's really what John said, which is the questions first. So it was all about how do you understand what's going on in the world, and then the next step is what are the questions that you need to ask to make progress in that establishing that understanding. So I think that's keeping that front of mind. I think he would think is crucial. And just a comment from Catherine Blair, who was going to be here, but unfortunately couldn't be here. She said, Andrew always taught us to think things through logically before answering. In the tutorial, when confronted with a simple question like, if that happens to X, what happens to Y, it often felt simplest to either repeat what I'd read in preparation or worse, take a guess. But Andrew saw straight through that. He made a point of never allowing us to simply learn the theory off by heart. We needed to understand the logic. And we weren't allowed out of his room until we had understood. So I think that's also what he would want to pass on. Maybe not kind of locking people in the room, but insisting that they could themselves articulate the answer to a problem and not simply regurgitate. So that would be on the teaching side. Anyone else? Ed.
I'm not very good at slogans, but I think to ask the question, his advice to the next tutor in his name would be help your students understand the world so they can change it.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's our slogan, actually, isn't it, Margaret? I wonder where that came from.
Maybe I could
yeah,
add
definitely.
So part of the picture which has been painted of Andrew, I mean, he comes across as someone who has very high expectations of his students, and someone described him, I think, as a disciplinarian. He knew what he wanted from his students. But on the other hand, he always took his students very seriously and listened to them. So it wasn't about telling them things. It was about getting students to talk, to think through their ideas, and he took those ideas seriously. And I think that's one of the really kind of, one of the strengths that he had as a teacher, which must have benefited so many students over the years.
You know, all of this speaks, I think, to the strength of the Oxford tutorial tradition. And it's obviously a very labor-intensive form of teaching. It can be very hard to do. Andrew showed what a deep influence a person could have on students by working in this mode, and he made it look fun. I mean, we all have these memories of how fun it was to be around him and to learn from him, and very strong personal relationships, which have lasted, in a sense, not just for a lifetime, but beyond a lifetime. And so Andrew might say to his distant successors, you know, have fun with this. It can be really rewarding, and you can make a huge difference in people's lives and enjoy it. And it's a very special job.
Can I just, before Jenny, there's someone who's been waiting online, David Moore. Interesting question. Fellowships like this at university will do fantastic things for future economists. I'd be interested to hear the panel's take on the future of economics teaching earlier on in the education system. So, yes, Margaret, do you want to? Well, I'll say one thing about it, just because I think the problem, I mean, I think everyone's kind of couched their questions here about how do you understand the world? And I would really like push down the education system to younger children, equipping them with the tools better to understand the world in which they're living. Whether you call that economics is a different question. And I think that's been a major problem, but it's got this label and shunted off to some, you know, A level, which isn't particularly interesting. And where the real campaign should be is for much younger children, children of 11 or 12, and presenting them with data. They're very curious, and that's a way of doing what we've been doing. And whether it's called economics or not, I think is a kind of secondary.
What you don't want is some kind of dumbed-down university course where you think you've just got to sort of somehow make the same stuff easier. I mean, I think maybe it touches on what Martin talked about earlier as well, that, you know, not kind of parceling away economics into a sort of silo, but talking about the kinds of questions we talk about in economics in the context of society as a whole, politics and philosophy, not putting boundaries in, but encouraging students to think broadly. And certainly the idea of students using data to understand the world. You don't have to kind of put any kind of theoretical framework necessarily onto it before thinking about what the data tells you about the world and getting students talking about that. Yeah. So,
if I may, we've got till 6:30.
We're running over, yeah.
I think it's.
Can I just, Helen, just say the last question for you to think about from Louise Vale. How would Andrew have engaged on social media?
That could be the conversational starter for the drinks, couldn't it? I think it's very apt that we ended there with some thinking about Andrew and students, and I think he might, if I may be so exercise such temerity, be pleased to think that we ended on that note. Thank you again very much indeed to our panel. today, both in person and remotely. And a very warm thank you again to all of you for joining us in person and online. And particular thanks to those of you who have donated towards the endowment of the Andrew Glyn Fellowship in Economics, which will ensure that his legacy continues in the conversation that is to come over drinks and dinner, but also long into the future. So thank you once again for joining us, and let's continue our reminiscences over a glass of something in the Reynolds room if you're in person, and do keep corresponding with us if you're remote as well. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to the panel.
Thank you.